just a few more bits of information in this document that I wanted to review. It's part 2. So the next section talks a little bit more about communication and the importance of that supervisory relationship, and how to ensure positive communication to get the job done. A couple of suggestions for setting it off on a good foot is to ensure that your therapist is establishing clear written goals. And there's a template towards the end of this document that has a proposed way of doing that. In my place of employment, we have a structure that we already use, but if you are in a place of employment where there's not a really clear structure, or you don't feel like you're getting enough detail, then that's something that you can always propose as just a more clear way to be aware of what the goals of therapy are and what the expectations are. So establishing that clear way of communicating the information is really important, and just having an open discussion about that. And then communicating with your therapist about the evaluation process, expectations for documentation, timing of therapy, things like that, and a process to resolve conflict is really important. And being open to feedback, because feedback is kind of the name of the game when it comes to therapy assistance. You're being supervised by therapists who all have different ways of wanting the work done. So you'll find that sometimes you need to do things one way to satisfy one therapist and then change that way for a different therapist. We as therapists are working hard to ensure too that we have a good relationship with you. It's not just a, supervisor, supervisee. We really want to build a relationship so that we can have trust and confidence in you as well. In this document, there's a link to some supervisory tips as well as the self-assessment of competencies for supervision that can be useful. But it's still possible for concerns to arise. And when concerns arise, be sure to bring them up to your therapist. And if you struggle with that conversation, or if you don't feel like it's appropriate to bring it to your therapist, you can bring it to your manager as well. But it's best to bring those concerns initially to your supervisor if possible. Now, of course, you are employed to do this work, and more often than not now, your supervising therapist will also be employed by the same employer as you. However, there are circumstances, and certainly historically, Alberta Health Services was a provider of speech therapists and audiologists to the schools, where the school boards were the employer. The schools were the employers of the assistants in those schools. So they had different employers, different hours of work, different expectations, and that definitely adds challenge to that relationship. Yeah, clarity of roles, really important to know what your scope is, what the therapist's scope is, what the expectations are. I'm going to skim over some of this because there's a lot of detail here that you don't necessarily need to know. We talked about that. Okay, the questions will come up around how many therapy assistants a supervisor can supervise, and there's no set number, but it really boils down to the type and the number of service activities that are assigned, skills and abilities of the support personnel, the experience of the SLP or audiologist, our own responsibility for providing service. So if I'm seeing a lot of my own clients, I'm not necessarily going to have time available to be able to supervise several therapy assistants. And also, I only work part-time, so I'm going to be doing that within the hours that I have available for that work. I also travel a fair bit, so work location and travel requirements are considerations as well for having time available to supervise. Okay, and then we come to a glossary of terms at the back. So if you run into something that you don't recognize within the document, you can go to this back section and get a definition for it. There's a few references, and then there's several templates, several appendices. So this one pager just summarizes those continuums of risk, how we decide your competence, that kind of thing, and how we decide on how much supervision to provide, all in one document. And then this is that intervention or care plan that I mentioned previously, where if you don't feel like the information you're getting from your therapist is clear enough to know exactly what's expected, you could always ask to use something like this. There's a supervisory plan. So if you want to set things off on the right foot, your therapist might work through a supervisory plan where you identify where your strengths are, where your challenges are, how frequently you'd like support, how many clients you can support in a day, all kinds of details like that. And then there's some tools here, communication styles inventory. There's a learning styles one where you reflect on your learning needs and how they match with your supervisors, or how your supervisor might need to change what they do to ensure that they're meeting your learning needs and supporting you in the way that you're going to do the best. So, for example, I usually have a conversation with my therapy assistants and my students about how they prefer me to provide that feedback. Are you comfortable with me jumping in the middle of a session and demonstrating, or asking you to do something? Or would you rather I wait until the end of the session and have that conversation one-on-one instead of in front of a client? So those are things that are important to navigate. And then at the end, also, there's a feedback form that's you're going to get a lot of feedback in your education and in your future work as a therapy assistant. And so feedback and setting up a good feedback relationship is also kind of the name of the game. And I think that is all that I'm going to cover. So that's a wrap on support personnel roles and responsibilities, but do be sure to read that entire document as well.